Hello, we're not going to work on Chapter 12, but we're working on Chapter 12 in our main textbook, so we're moving away from that tutorial document for a little while. And you can see that the topic here for Chapter 12 is a thing that we call single-page applications, and we're going to create that with a front-end development framework called Angularjs. Now, we will... and actually I should probably point this out right off the bat. If you look at the very top of the chapter here, they do have a file that they want you to download if you want to look at the completed version of this, and that might not be a bad idea in terms of looking at it for reference. But we are going to step through the exercises here in the chapter, so whether or not you want to do that is kind of up to you. I don't think it's a bad idea, because that way you can always look at it and see if you did the things according to spec. But the process of building the application that they're talking about in this chapter is a process, so sometimes you do some stuff and then you change it later, just so you know that. And the topic here is kind of an interesting one. We're moving into this era right now of web development where JavaScript is really kind of becoming so prominent in so many different ways, and as a result of it, we're starting to see a whole bunch of frameworks that are intended for accelerating web development. And frankly, folks, there are so many of them, it's almost hard to keep track. And some of them have different purposes. So for example, as you learn JavaScript, you typically learn how to work with like jQuery. That's usually one of the first libraries that you learn. And even with these .NET projects that we've been working on, sometimes the jQuery libraries automatically get added in to do particular tasks. Now that particular framework, jQuery, if you use that as kind of a basis of comparison, one of the reasons it was developed was to kind of accelerate the development of front-end work. So if you wanted to do movement or apply CSS to an object, or just simply hide something or show something or what have you, or do some math or something like that, apply some logic to the screen, jQuery allowed you a very quick and elegant way to do some of those things without writing lots of JavaScript code and needing to debug it and troubleshoot it and all those things. Very much the same way, we've also seen JavaScript become kind of a back-end framework via Node.js, where it actually runs server-side and does some of the work that we normally would give to C# or PHP or other languages like that. Now Angular is a completely different technology. Its focus is on the front end, so that's important to note. But it works elegantly with various back-end platforms, so you can combine it with other back-end JavaScript frameworks like Node.js, that's real popular to do, or with PHP or C# or what have you. Obviously, being in a .NET class, we're going to be combining it with C#. So we do have a standard back-end language, but this is a front-end framework. And like jQuery, its intention is to help us build things more quickly that do sophisticated on-screen application actions without having to write a significant amount of code to make it happen. Angular is probably one of the most popular front-end frameworks, frankly. And I don't know what they say about it here too much. Well, I guess they talk about it quite a bit. But the other real popular one out there these days is one called React. And for those of you that are in the web program, right now it's fall 2019 as I record this video. We're just on the eve of the launch of here in the web program of us teaching those two technologies formally as entire courses. So they will be elective offerings, by the way. So if you guys really want to dig into Angular or React, our first offerings will be this spring. And they'll be online only to start with, but as we move forward, you'll probably see classroom versions of those. And I know the web degree has enough room for 2 elective courses. And so if you're looking for courses to add, I think those are really excellent ones to throw in. Both of them do roughly the same types of actions in slightly different ways. And each of them also has a number of different versions, not to complicate things. But it'll give you a flavor of what you do out in the field. The thing that's kind of fascinating with this is that combination of back-end JavaScript and front-end frameworks on JavaScript is really kind of driving a lot of what we call full-stack web development, and they're very, very popular. I might argue that Angular has maybe plateaued a little bit, maybe is even slightly on the decline, but it's still a hugely employed framework. And then React, I think, is one that's still on the rise, at least as I'm recording this video. You know, things change over time. Are those the only frameworks that you can work with? Absolutely not at all. The thing that's kind of interesting about these technologies is the other technologies that they work with. Because this is a JavaScript framework, the syntax and the approach to it is often, I would say, familiar looking. You know, it might not be exactly like JavaScript, but the approach of like using curly brackets, for example, you'll see that's one aspect of it. Another thing that is done often with this type of technology is we create what we call single-page applications. And you may have experienced this, and maybe even experienced it, not really given it second thought, where you land on a web page and you're interacting with it, and you might be scrolling and moving around and clicking on things, and you might be making things appear and disappear depending on what you're doing. But in reality, you're not even leaving the page. Everything's just happening in that window. And really the move here is to try to simulate what we do natively in the operating system. And if you think about when you bring an application up on your screen, you don't want to have like necessarily multiple windows of Microsoft Word to do your Word document processing. You just want one screen, and that's kind of the thinking behind this. The way that this technology interacts with other technologies is kind of fascinating. So like one of the big takeaways that you get is a lot of the data that's moved back and forth from JavaScript applications tends to be written in what we call a JSON format, which is JavaScript object notation, and that's an aspect of it as well. All right, so they're going to talk here a little bit about how you get moving on this and what it is, and I think I've talked about it a little bit. But because it is a front-end framework, it doesn't mean that we're stepping away from the whole MVC construct, and that's kind of like the tie-in here. What's beautiful about AngularJS is, yes, it is used with a lot of open source languages, but it works really well with the .NET languages and the MVC infrastructure. So all the C# that we've learned, all the, if you want to use Razor code, you can use all that. It'll work just fine. But we also still have access to kind of like what I consider acceleration tools, really, which is scaffolding and the whole MVC architecture, where we can build data models and interact with pretty sophisticated components with a great degree of ease, in my opinion. So what we're going to start doing here is we're going to follow this tutorial that they have. I am going to be shuffling this off to the other screen. There's some spots in here where you got to be careful with some of the selections that you make, and fortunately I've stumbled over these a few times before, so I can help you kind of work around it. I will tell you that building in this framework can be kind of a combination of like quick and easy, and sometimes you're wondering why things aren't working. And I know last time we ran into significant issues in class, it's because we chose the wrong version of Angular to work with, not realizing that the language went kind of through this major transformation. So you'll notice that if you look up modern versions of Angular, they don't call it AngularJS anymore. They just call it Angular. And there's a difference between AngularJS and Angular. And what we're learning in this book, in this chapter, is AngularJS, the old version. So I think that's an important distinction. So just please keep that in your head as we work. I'm going to move the document over to screen number 2. Let's get that out of the way. If I can get it to just respond to my mouse here. right, so the first thing they'd like us to do is to go ahead and create a new .NET application named At the Movies. Now I may choose a different name because depending on where I drop this, I might already have it there. I don't think I have it on my local folder on my desktop, but I know that the databases, for example, I probably have those already created. All right, so let's go ahead and choose Create New Project. We're going to go ahead and choose the same ASP.NET web application that we've been doing all along with the .NET framework, so C#, Windows, and Web. I'm clicking Next. And then they do want us to call it At the Movies. But here's what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hyphenate this, folks, and say At the Movies. And I'm not sure if this is a wise choice or not, but we'll find out as we go. And I'm having like second thoughts about it already, so I'm just thinking maybe I'll do this. And I'm going to call it At the Movies 3, because I know I have a 1 and a 2 out there for sure. All right. I'm going to put that right on my desktop where I've been working lately. Not my main preference, but that's what I'm doing. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Create. All right. So now they want us to actually pick our framework, and instead of choosing empty, we are going to go to actually Web API for this. So this is where it gets kind of interesting. And the reason we do this is it does allow us to create what we call a RESTful application. We learned about that a little bit last time. It gives us all that standard like MVC power in the background too. We are going to add, notice when you choose that, it automatically adds the references for MVC and for Web API, creating the folders for it. We're not worried about authentication at this point, and I am going to uncheck HTTPS just to make the project a little bit more efficient in size. Not worried about unit tests or anything like that. And then we're going to go ahead and click Create and let it build out. All right, now the very first thing it would like us to do is to go ahead and run the application. Now, this will be built on top of Bootstrap because of the template selections that we made, so we're going to just let this build out. And what we're doing right now, and I always like to mention this because I guess sometimes, you know, when we teach these programming classes, we don't always talk about some programming conventions. So here's one programming convention, folks. Very often when you build a new project like this with compiled code, sometimes you just build it and run it right after you've created it to create what we call a clean build. So in other words, a build that doesn't have bugs in it or flaws. So if you ever hear that terminology, what that means is we're running it just to compile all the code that's already there. So I want you to think about what that means. There's so much stuff that is automatically added in this framework. I mean, we put in a number of different components, but because of all the selections that we made, you know, Bootstrap is here, Modernizer is here, jQuery is here, you know, there's views that are pre-created, we have an app data folder, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these things that are already there, and we do this for the sake of cleanly building the code and making sure everything's running. So it gives us kind of like a starting point for the application. So we've kind of looked at this interface before, obviously, so we know that this is like standard Bootstrap output. So it has a certain like look and feel to it. I'm going to go to 100% so you can see what it looks like. We of course built none of this, but you can go in there and tweak it and change it, make it whatever you want. But it doesn't look too bad considering, right? I think it looks very nice. All right. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and configure the site to use Angular. So let's. We're now on page 359 of the main text, and I'm looking at the printed page number, by the way. And what they would like us to do is to go ahead and install Angular, and they guide us there in kind of an unusual way. So because I'm not comfortable with the way they're guiding us, because it does not allow us version selection, I see it as kind of problematic. The other thing that is becoming apparent to me is perhaps when this book was written, Angular was new, and the only way that you could add it was what they show in the book, which is actually to go to the package manager, right? And I didn't see, of course I didn't see the little tool that I wanted, but I was looking for the tool where you can run the console. Remember, you guys remember doing it from the console. So that's what the book says, to install the package from the console. But here's the deal, folks. Wrong answer, because that's going to load the latest version. And I know from experience in this class that our tutorial is on version 1, not on version 2 or 3. And like I said before, this is AngularJS, not Angular. All right, very similar, but not exactly the same thing. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up here to the Browse menu and just type Angular. So Angular. All right, and the library they want us to load is the AngularJS Core. I do want you to realize, though, that Angular, like a lot of other libraries like this, have many, many aspects to them. Even jQuery has many aspects to it. But you notice that they also have an Angular User Interface Bootstrap tool. Interesting. I wonder what that does. And then there's a routing tool, an animation tool. You can sanitize, another router, some resources, some cookies, utilities, you guys getting the idea here that this is a very robust interface. And then as you start getting down to some of these other ones, Angular Google Maps. So wait, oh my God, it's got like built-in libraries for just pulling Google Maps right into your applications. Yes, it does. So these are the kind of things that happen when you use these frameworks, is they're giving you tools. And you notice upload, translate, etc., etc., etc. It is not a small list, and these are all separate libraries that all do separate things, and you can kind of read and explore on your own, right? Unfortunately, we only have so much time in this class, so let's go ahead and choose Angular Core here. Now, before you go ahead and click install, and I hope you didn't do it yet, this is where we need to be careful. So the version numbers that we're using go way, way back, and you see where it starts out. And frankly, I'm going to pause the video here, bring up an old version of this project, and make sure with a high degree of certainty which framework version to choose, because there's no indication in the book as to which one to choose. But I know from my experience last year and I think the year before, where we chose the latest stable version and it was not at all what we wanted, and it became very problematic because none of the commands we were typing in would work. So pausing the video just to make sure. So after referencing my project from, I think, last fall, I think is the last time I actually did this, we selected version 1.2 to make sure that it works. So it's actually the lowest version number available here. And it's not an anomaly, folks. It really is just to make sure that the book code works correctly in your project. Of course, if you were working with more modern versions, you probably would go with the cutting edge stuff, but then our code examples from the book might not work, and that's very frustrating if you're trying to do a tutorial or something. So that's why we're making this selection. So what you're seeing on the screen now is actually my old version of the application. I believe, I hope I chose the right one. And I suppose I can double check that with the properties, like where it's stored. I'm just looking for my save location here. All right, and this must be the previous version, and the reason I say that is I'm going to go ahead and close this, folks, and just reopen the project that I just had. So apparently I must have closed the wrong version, so I'm just reopening it. Yeah, well, 3 is the one I just created today. So I'm going to open that one up. And then I'm going to go ahead, right-click, do the package manager again, typing in Angular, pulling in the core, selecting version 1.2. We know this is the right one because it's not installed yet, right? So go ahead and choose install and just follow through the screens. All right. You will notice, as you maybe were watching the screen here, that in the scripts folder it did add a bunch of Angular stuff, including minified versions and a couple of other tools. So that's kind of the byproduct of it. All right, let me see where we are in our document now. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is to make sure that we include this in the application core. So with everything that we do, it's going to call upon the Angular libraries to run whatever code it is that we need to run. Right. The one place where we can do this is on the home page in this application. Remember, we're building a single page application here. And so we're going to go to the views, home folder, and index CS.html and pull that up. And then, you know, what they're suggesting here, right, because we're building kind of our own framework, right, is they're suggesting remove all the markup inside the index view. And I want you to look at this really quick, though. Do you notice as you look at this, it does not start with a doc type? You guys catching that? And there's no header or body or HTML tag or any of the stuff that starts the page. It doesn't even include the menus. When you see the first div here that's listed, it says div class Jumbotron. That's that big ASP.NET window that's on the page. So the menu and the header and the footer are still there, but we're not manipulating those. We're just manipulating the content in the middle of the page. And that's why they're boldly telling us go ahead and just get rid of all this stuff. So I'm just doing a Control-A to highlight all and pressing delete. Then at the bottom of page 359, they have some code here that I'm just going to copy and paste in, but then I'm going to show you kind of a different approach all at the same time. So I'm just going to paste this in. All right. And one of the dangers that you get when you do paste in code is if you're not following their directions precisely, sometimes the relative links that you put in don't work right. And maybe you've experienced that. But you're doing here kind of a combination of calling a script, but notice how they're doing it. They're doing it with Razor code. So they're doing it programmatically, and they're calling in the script file. And it just so happens that that path is fine. Okay. And then they also create a div, and I want you to notice that it's a div kind of with like an attribute without quotes around it or anything. You guys noticing that? It's kind of weird. And then these like 2 plus 3 inside of 2 sets of curly brackets? Well, folks, this is Angular code right here. So this is an Angular directive to do the math. That's what that is if you didn't figure it out. But the other thing I want to show you is if you ever want to add a script to like a .NET application, and even though this is already here, I'm going to take the Angular library and pull it in. Right, that's not where I wanted to put it. Thank you very much, Microsoft. I'm just going to drag and drop it in right up into the razor section here. And you see what it did for me? And that is really the approach you really want to use in this environment. You don't want to hand code the stuff. Drag and drop it and let it automatically generate the right code. Why think about what you need to type? Just let the drag and drop mechanism do that. And of course, now it's throwing a bunch of errors because it's saying, hey, you just already did that. Why are you doing it again? Right? And I'm not that much of an idiot, but it was really more for the demonstration of that. And so anytime that we're going to be pulling in the scripts to use Angular, that's the methodology we would prefer to use. And same with jQuery or any other JavaScript library.
So did we have to create the razor section scripts, or was that already created for us?
That was the sample code. So the question was, did we have to create this? It was at the bottom of page 359 in our main textbook. So yes, you would have to create it. I mean, if it wasn't there. In this case, I just did a copy paste from our text. All right. So the next thing that they're going to want us to do, of course, is to run the application. So go ahead and do a save all and hit the run button. And now as the application loads up and runs, it will take us to a page that will display this content. So that like Jumbotron thing with the ASP.NET thing in the middle, that's not going to appear. We will still have the header section with the navigation, and I believe the footer as well, once it loads up. But instead of, you know, the Jumbotron and all that weird content, it's just going here. And you notice what it did, right? Here is 5. So this shows you that the framework loaded up correctly and it did the math, right? Because normally, if I would type 2 plus 3 inside an HTML document, it would just show me 2 plus 3. Now, it wouldn't do the math. Because it's inside that set of 2 curly brackets, it realizes it's an Angular directive, along with the fact that we have this as an attribute inside the div. And if you haven't figured it out yet, NG stands for Angular. I don't know how they get there, but that's what it stands for. And that's how it knows to trigger the engine to check the code. All right. You know, I look at our output and I say, well, that looks pretty hideous. But then again, you know, there it is. It's working. I mean, I would probably create a little space above that, you know, but we can do all sorts of HTML stuff later. But, you know, the whole point is that this has special meaning for it. So, all right. The other thing that they're pointing out, so I'm looking right now at page 360 and kind of reading through that content. And they, you know, the author says a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you to, kind of in his own special kind of way. And what he's suggesting now on that page, so going to the bottom of page 360, is he's showing what he calls a different variation of the code. So, and I'm not really saying how it's a different variation. But here, let me bring this back over to this screen. Maybe that'll help to maybe clarify it a little bit. All right. So he shows, you know, first of all, that here, this is the way we call an Angular application. But another way to pull in an Angular application is also to use the data prefix. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with that or not, but that's basically, it's an attribute that they've added late to the HTML5 standard, which allows us to kind of create what we call custom attributes for HTML tags very much for the purpose of driving, custom libraries and applications and other capabilities. Now, I'm not going to type this code in, but what they're saying is that you can also use the data tag to do this. And the reason you might actually prefer to do this is just so it stays compliant with the HTML5 standard, which really requires custom attributes to have that data prefix. All right, so either one of those approaches that you see on the screen is valid. Now, what about this funky statement they have here? And I want to point this out. Ignoring the curly brackets in that document. This is what we call a new modern approach to doing if statements. And some of you may have learned this approach already, and I forget what they call it off the top of my head. Yeah, some languages will call it that, immediate if. Some of them will call it, I don't know, but they do it in Python a lot. But the truth is, all the major languages, Java, C#, all the C languages, JavaScript, and really a whole bunch of others are supporting this format. And just so you understand what it is, it's a connection of 3 statements. And this only works if you have singular statements inside of it. So for example, the first thing that you look at, this is the condition that we're testing. So it's kind of like saying if true, or it could be like an equation or an equality or something. And the question mark says then, so if then execute the first statement. If it's not true, then execute the second statement with the colon in it. And so that's becoming real popular. That does work in Angular as well. The reason it works in Angular is because that's part of JavaScript. JavaScript supports it. And it's really kind of a quick and elegant way to do really simple if statements, which often is all you need. Sometimes you need to put 10 statements inside there and have verbose output, and that won't work, obviously. But if you have a really simple little statement that maybe just checks to see if x is greater than 0, if true, say hello, if not, say goodbye. And that's kind of a nice little shortcut approach. And now I see what the name is because it's right up on the screen. It's called the Ternary Operator. Yeah, that's what they're calling it. So just in case, maybe that would be a good one for the exam. What do you think? That's not a promise, but I'm telling you, it's a definite possibility. All right. So right now, the example that we have is a pretty simplistic one. But what's kind of fascinating about all this is if you do a right-click and view source, and whenever you're working with a weird technology, I would encourage you real strongly to get in the habit of doing that. So this is the code that was output to the browser. And then you'll notice that what was output to the browser, unlike a back-end language, it's not rewriting the code. You guys catching that? What it's doing is it's just this is a front-end framework. So it operates in the client. We don't alter the code to push it to the browser. It goes to the browser just the way it was intended. It's the Angular framework that kicks in via the JavaScript library, also operates in the browser, and then performs the action that we have on the screen. When it becomes a little bit more interesting, frankly, is when we start to tie this in to some of the MVC type of structures and to a data source. So that's kind of where we're going next. So in the document now in our textbook, middle of page 361, they have a section called Setting Up the Database. So that's what we're going to do next. So the next task that we have is to, well, I guess we should probably stop the application from running. That would be probably wise. And we're going to go ahead, top of the project node here in Solution Explorer, we're going to give it a right click, and we're going to bring up the NuGet package manager. Once again, the book is saying do this from the command line, and I'm having you do it like the way that I would do it, which is from here. Why would you do it from the command line, right? That's kind of my thinking. So we're going to put in the entity framework again. And once again, like we did for, like we did in the scaffolding chapter, and because of our experience with things not working, we are going to go down to version 6.2, and just to be on the safe side. Once you've made that selection, go ahead and click install. So these steps are just like what we saw in some of the previous sections in the other tutorials. All right, so it's running through its process here, and then it did say successful, I believe. There we go. Successfully installed. And now we're going to go back over here. Now there's a bunch of errors popping up here, and I'm not really sure what they're all about, but none of them, you guys noticing? All of these are in the Angular libraries. So hopefully these aren't anything that keep us from functioning, but I'm not worried about that because I didn't write those. So I'm not at all worried about it. All right. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to build a class file to have some sort of a data source. Excuse me. All right. So let's go ahead and go to the models folder, and let's give that a right click. And we're going to go ahead and add a class file here. All right. And just make sure it's the right language, C#. And we're going to just call this movie singular. And I'll tell you what, the first time I did this off of this book, I think I accidentally typed movies, and then I kind of threw off everything I was doing. Because I tried to follow the book example and copy the code, and yeah, not a good thing. So here very explicitly they're saying movie singular class. Go ahead and add that. So it's just a C# file that's empty. That's all that does. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to build out our data model by just specifying the fields that would be involved. So very much like we did in our other application, I'm just copying in the code here. This is on page 361 in the book. All right, so that creates an ID, a title, release year, and runtime, and that's relative to a movie. Okay. The next thing that they want us to do is to add that database context, and you can see how these activities are kind of routine after a while, like if you've done them a few times. And so we're going to paste in, the database context. So I got it highlighted once again in the book, and pasting it over. All right. Just like we saw in the previous video, if you hover over database context, we need to get the entity framework attached to this file, and I'm just going to pull in using system data entity, so that gets the framework in there and allows this to see it in that format. Now we are going to need to jump into the package manager console at this point. And if you guys remember when we did some database migration stuff in the past, that's what we have to do right now. So just from a conceptual standpoint, and I think this is really important, because if you didn't pick it up earlier in the class, what we're about to do when we create a migration in an application is we created a data file here that sets up the structure of our database, or database table more specifically. And because this just exists as a file right now, we have to run a migration in order to actually incorporate it into the application and build out the database piece that we need. So we need to go to the package manager console. So I'm at the tools menu, and you get package manager, and then I'm choosing package manager console. And that will bring up a command line window here at the bottom, just like we've seen in the past. And the command that we want to type is enable-migrations with capital E and M. just like so.
I'm sorry, it's a view, package manager console?
Actually, go to the Tools menu this time. You get Package Manager, and then the console. Yeah, last time, you know, what I did is I came here, and I just went to, it wasn't even there, was it? Here, I went to Manage, NuGet Packages, which is the equivalent of the right-click here. But we need the console, so we have to go to the Tools menu, Package Manager, and then Console. All right. Once you have this command typed in, go ahead and press Enter. It's just a simple command line interface that we have here. Let's give it a second to do its magic. You can look at the output. It says checking to see if it references an existing database, and then notice the output. And I think the output's really telling, because really what we just did, folks, like if you were building your own application, this is exactly how you might start building a database piece to it. Of course, you want to conceptualize it first before you go just dropping code in. But notice it said, code first migrations enabled for project at the movies 3. So we are using a code-first approach. We wrote the code first, we turned on migrations, and then when the project builds, it builds out the database components for us. We don't have to go into a database tool and do any of the work, it just does it. Now the thing that happens as a result of this is it will create a folder within the project called migrations. If you look off to the right here, you can see that folder listed right here. Inside that folder, there's a configuration CS file, which just popped up on the screen here. All right. Now this file is used to help guide the process of the migrations. All the migrations that you do will store here as files. And then really all we've done is basically pre-created this so that we can put in the stuff that we need when we run the migration. All that we did in the first step is made it possible to do the migrations. We didn't actually perform them yet. We just flipped the switch and said, okay, now it's possible. The lights are on. Now what you do with the lights on is up to you. And then that's where we come in. So the first thing that you're going to see is that they are going to have this section here, the protected section, where we're going to put our code. So there's some code at the top of page 362 that I'd like you to copy and paste into this commented section. They try to give you a little bit of a clue here on how to do that, but I'm just going to begin by just eliminating that stuff to start with. The other thing that I'm going to do is, I know, and I'm looking at the book carefully, and once again, I'll just bring this over so I can show you what I'm looking at so you're not wondering. And I'm trying to set it up so you can see kind of both at the same time. But I'm looking at the code, and you might be tempted to change the first line here to match up what's here, but here's my strong word of caution: do not. Right? So one thing that you'll notice is I name mine a little bit different than what the author did. And you know, he was able to just say movie database context, but you know what, I'm putting in here, or the tool did automatically, it gave me a fully qualified namespace, which I'm sticking with. You know why it did that is because that's correct. That's why. So don't mess with what it created that's correct already, just to try to match what's in the book. Don't do that. What is important is the stuff inside here. So I'm going to grab all of this code and do a Control-C to copy, and then I'm going to come in and paste it. Now what I'm hoping is that this stuff is not going to flag red. It did anyhow, right? Thank you very much, Microsoft. Not that we can really blame them, honestly. But here I'm looking to do like a little bit of code formatting. In fact, if I have all of this highlighted, it seems to be relatively in the right format. You can actually just tab it all over manually, so I'll just do that instead. Now you will notice that movie is highlighting red. And let's see if we can hover over that and see if we can figure out why it's doing that. All right. So it says the type or namespace movie could not be found. You are missing a using directive or an assembly reference. That sounds familiar, right? So no, in other words, no need to panic. Let's go to potential fixes and take a look at what it suggests. And it says using at the movies 3 models. You know, that's our model, right? So you know what? Let's do it. Let's make that option, and then you'll see that the highlight will go away. So this is just our way to attach to the model. If you look at the code in the book, I don't believe that they even mention that, but you know what? That's why you have me, right? To help guide you. And I would assume that perhaps by this point in working in this book, that they assume that, you know, somebody who's sharp and learning this stuff probably can figure their way around it. But very often, you know, one of the first 1 or 2 suggestions that they give you are the correct ones to fix whatever's going on. So go with it. Don't shy away from it. All right. The other thing that they're going to suggest that we do is actually change the configuration option for automatic migrations from false to true. So let me explain what that setting does. When we did this in the past and we created some migrations, and I don't know if you remember that well, it wasn't that long ago, we had to go back to the Package Manager console and then run the migrations to actually build the stuff out in the database. And that's the default, right? They assume that if you're going to do that, you probably want to do it manually. But what they're suggesting is that you switch this to true. And that way, as you do your build, it will automatically run the migrations for you. All right. We do want to actually go ahead and save all this and enable the migrations. So we're going to bring up that console again. I managed to get mine out of the way just to have a little more screen space. And now we're going to issue the command update database with a capital U, a dash, and a capital D. Now as I press enter on this, what it's going to do is it's going to look at the file that we were just working with above, and then it goes through and gives us a message. And I'm just trying to make sure that it's doing the right thing. So it says specify the dash verbose flag to see the SQL statements being applied to the target database. Isn't that cool? So if you actually want to see this tool doing your work for you, that's the capability. This is very similar for anybody that's ever learned how to do like Ruby on Rails, and that's one that we used to teach here at Gateway. That tool, whenever you would do a database migration, I mean, you didn't have a choice. It just automatically showed you all the SQL statements. And so really what we're doing here, folks, is we are using an abstraction tool. This is what it is by definition, meaning that we set up a structure, we ran this command, and then it automatically built out all the database stuff we need by typing up the SQL statements for us, and it's just obscuring it. Now it also says no pending explicit migrations, and I want you to think about that. Does that mean that it didn't do it, or it did do it? It says applying automatic migration, and why is it automatic? Because we turned it on to true, right? So it's not applying any explicit ones, meaning any that we type by hand at the keyboard. That's what it's implying to us, right? So the message you see here is slightly different than what's being shown in the book, but functionally it really is the same. Whenever you see this thing and it says running seed method, when we seed a database, we're seeding it either with structure, you know, a table structure, or we're seeding it with data. In this case, guess what? We were doing both, right? We were creating the structure and we were seeding it with data. All right, so at the very bottom of page 362, the author says, with a database in place, you can now create an API to manipulate and retrieve the data inside. Okay, so that's kind of what we did. Now, we could actually switch over to the SQL Server Object Explorer, and if you don't have that tab over here by Solution Explorer, you can simply go to View and select it from there. But since I already do have it there, I'm going to click on it, and this is going to pull up whatever database objects we have created. And I want you to notice kind of like a couple of different things. So once again, if you are running SQL Server natively in your environment, so if you had it loaded up from your databases class and never shut it down, it will propagate over to that database. Otherwise, what it's going to do is it's going to work with the internal local database that's built right into Visual Studio, which is technically SQL Server Express, lightweight version, does most of the major operations. You'll also notice here with the project, how the project is loaded, but you can see I hit that little drop down here and it didn't expand. But where it actually is located is here. So if I look at the Movies 3, expand that, go to the tables, you will see my movies. You can right click and view data. Now if I see any data in here, you see what's happening? There is data in here. And guess what, folks? This is from the last time I did this. So apparently At the Movies 3 wasn't the right choice. I should have called it At the Movies 4. Yeah, so, which is why, another reason why my message was a little different. I had the suspicion, I thought I was, beyond whatever version I created, but yeah, okay, so I should have, next time I'll check the database first, mental note. But if this was not here, it would have created it, but it would be empty. So what you guys should do is check to see if it did create it, and that it indeed, well actually no, it's not empty. Boy, no, it shouldn't be empty. I'm not thinking clearly here, because here in the configuration file, we actually added those. So strike my comment about it already being there. Maybe I did just create this.
So it should be empty.
No, it should not be empty, and that's because in the configuration file we added these movies, right? And are those the movies that are in there? Star Wars, Inception, and Toy Story. Yes, absolutely.
The update database should have created it.
Yes. It should have created the table, and it should have seeded it with data. So make sure that that's working for you. That's probably one of the trickier parts of doing this, is doing that aspect of it. Okay, so I have somebody here in the classroom working with me that is working on one of the classroom machines, and those machines all do have SQL Server running in the background, so the database would not propagate to the local database structure like we see listed here. It would actually go to SQL Server. So one way that you can check to see if it got there is by looking at, you can bring up your SQL Server Management Studio and find it, and go search for the table, basically. The other thing that you can do is you can figure out what the instance name is of SQL Server on your system, and then add that to this interface here. So what I'm thinking, excuse me, is that you would click here. Now, for me, this is kind of irrelevant, but you would come here, you would look for local, and then SQL Server should pop up on the list here. Of course, you'll have to put the server name in and then log in. And for anybody that's done database work on your own machine, like if you were in the databases class, you'll be very familiar with this process. So however you would log into your local SQL server, that's what you would do. And then it would pull it up onto this list and you would see your database there. So and I realize that a lot of students, when they take these classes, especially when they get to the databases class, because that's quite a big product to load, sometimes they opt to not load that full product into the interface. So I'm going to just take a pause here really quick and just make sure that everybody has it going, just to make sure that they can run the application. Now the other, before I hit pause, the other way that you can test to see if it's there or not is when we get to the next section and actually start building out the interface on the front end where we would look at this data. And then, obviously if you can see the data, it's obviously connected. So let's take a pause here for a second and take a look. Okay, so for those of you that are working on this and perhaps you're struggling with the database aspect of it, if you are running a local instance of SQL Server, what I would suggest that you do at this point, if it doesn't seem to be behaving right within the product, bring up your SQL Server Management Studio and go into the database and look for an at the movies database or table, and see if your stuff is there with the 3 seeded entries that we just typed in. With any luck it is, and even though it's operating externally from the product, it'll work just fine. It's just working with an external database rather than an internal. And if you're still having issues with it, I might suggest that you turn off SQL Server, so don't have it launch at boot. And one of the ways you can do that is you actually go down to your task manager here and go to services. You can find MS SQL Server. Well, it depends on how you sort. You got to sort by name, I suppose. Yeah, and of course I'm not going to find it because I'm not running it. But the entry will say MS SQL Server in all caps. Stop that from running, and then you can run the internal product. But you might have to recreate the steps that we did building the model and the data that we're injecting, just so you know. Otherwise, if everything is working okay, this is about as far as we can get tonight. We're just about out of time here. So we're going to pick up next week at the bottom of page 363. So we're gonna pick up right here, or the top of the page 363, because this is a good starting point building the user interface. All right, this video ends here.